All right, how is everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel. Thanks for tuning in. This is an educational channel, and we try to check in on some great theories of everything, grand unified theories, all-encompassing theories, magnum opuses, tour de forces, and earth-shattering discoveries from obscure sources. And this is our 250th Bible Decode. All of them so far from the New Testament. And we're checking into the relatively obscure at this point theory of the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. Many authors have proffered this theory that the New Testament was written in whole, or at least in part, by the Romans, the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars. It's Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, from 69 until 96 AD. They were in charge of the empire, and they backdated the story of the Gospels by 40 or so years. And then at the same time, they wrote a history of a war that was generaled by Emperor Vespasian before he became emperor, and his son, General Titus, before he became emperor. And in that war, the Romans were fighting against the Jews. The book's called War of the Jews, or the Jewish War, and is written under the name of Josephus, or Josephus. And Josephus is also known as Flavius, Josephus of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars. He was an adopted member, according to his own autobiography, that talks about him being a general for the, or at least a military commander for the Jews in this war, but eventually surrenders to Vespasian and then decides that the God is now favoring the Romans and not the Jews. So he defected to the Jews, predicted Vespasian would one day become emperor. When Vespasian did become emperor, Vespasian hooked him up, eventually brought him back to Rome to be the new, one of the new court historians, gave him a townhouse at Caesar's palace, and adopted him as a member of his family. I find that story pretty hard to believe, especially since almost the exact story is told about Yohanan ben Zakkai, who was a Pharisaic Jew who had the same story with Vespasian, or possibly Titus, where he predicted that he would one day become emperor. And this is also a later version of the story that happens with one of the early Essenes, so-called, because I don't believe that they existed either, but one of the Essenes, this is according to Josephus, one of the Essenes predicted that Herod the king would one day become king, and when Herod became king, he was always very lenient toward the Essenes, is how the story goes. So anyway, this is a theme and not so much a reality. But if you read the 7 volumes of War of the Jews by Josephus, you will notice, reading it alongside the Gospels, that the authors are the same. Whoever wrote Josephus also wrote the Gospels. There's an abundance of, a great abundance of parallels between the two. and they form many different themes and carry many messages. You can feel the intentionality coming from the Romans. The idea for Vespasian and Titus was as a psychological operation against the Jews, as part of a military weapon, more or less, to mellow out the Jews. The Jews had been a thorn in the Roman side for over 100 years, and always rebelling and uprising and revolting and even warring against the Romans. And Vespasian and Titus had both been wounded in the war, and I think they were just sick of it from the Jews. And even though they completely decimated Jerusalem and really all of Israel in this war, they knew that the Jews were so resilient that they were coming back. And so they decided to really take advantage of the fact that the Jews were waiting on a Messiah who was going to be a military commander to, overthrow the Romans. And they instead wrote about a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and believed in rendering under Caesar what is Caesar's, walking the extra mile and turning the other cheek, and at the same time going to the Jews and overturning the tables of the money changers and clashing with the Jews who were selling small animals for the sacrifice at the temple. So in other words, Jesus is totally deferential to the Romans while he is actively trying to disrupt the practices and rituals of the Jews. He also insisted that several of his disciples abandon their families to follow him, with not even enough time to bury the father or even inform the father, family member, wife, and children where you've gone. You just abandon them. So Jesus is taking aim at the Jewish traditions. And then when you go further into the text, you see the Pauline epistles, and Paul is even more pro-Roman and anti-Jew than Jesus was. So there's just a lot of it, and that's what the Romans were trying to do. And they had done the same thing almost exactly before and at the same time in the first century. So this is right exactly what the Romans' method of operation is. This is exactly what the Romans would have done. And the Romans obviously had the means and the opportunity to do this, and they were the only people who had the means and the opportunity, given that they had full control of censorship, publishing, and distribution within the Roman Empire. The Roman emperors, particularly Titus and Vespasian, were literally gods. They were both deified posthumously by the Roman Senate. So the Vespasian and Titus literally were gods by law. So this is obviously not a stretch for them to, be tampering with who is and who isn't a god. Now, if you get into the patterns of the parallels between the two books, like Michael Menescotts did in his new book called Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, he found over 250 parallels between the two books just in the book of Luke, and then organized them on a chart, and found that they form 5 almost perfect letters in Latin, the language, the emerging language of the Roman Caesars. But they also spoke Greek, and that is the language of the Gospels, as well as Josephus. Joseph Atwill looked into, in his 2005 book, Caesar's Messiah, looked into the patterns, the correspondences or parallels between the ministry of Jesus and the military campaign of Titus, both in Judea. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes, in the same order, and they both encounter parallel events at each location that are spaced out by exactly 40 years. We're talking about over 40 separate events. Also, many of the prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament are fulfilled in the pages of War of the Jews. And many of them are fulfilled by Titus, especially the one about the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. And Jesus says of that destruction that was the sign of his second coming, thereby making Titus the second coming of Jesus. And again, not a big stretch, given that, Titus and Vespasian really believed they were God and, were deified after their lifetimes. They were Caesars. Now, at the time, they were just generals. So maybe they were just up-and-coming gods. Now, what we're looking at, we're in the conclusion here of this book called Operation Messiah, written by Rosemary Sheldon and Thies Voskuilen. And in this book, they don't go all the way to the Roman origins hypothesis. They cut it short. They don't believe the Romans wrote the New Testament, but they do sniff out something very fishy about Paul and his behavior, his pro-Roman and anti-Jewish behavior. That's pretty much over the top, to the point where they noticed it, even though they don't notice the almost as blatant behavior of Jesus. So they focus in on Paul, and by doing so, they don't entertain the possibility that the Romans composed the whole thing, and they obviously then believe that the story is somewhat the truth, and they believe that Paul was an actual person and that he was a Roman intelligence agent. On his road to Damascus, he faked a conversion in order to infiltrate the Nazarenes, the Jewish Christian movement of the followers of Jesus, from his brother James and Peter. So that is what their hypothesis is, and they went through the various evidence. I thought that they lost a lot of their analysis because they weren't willing to go there with Jesus, even though they went there with Paul. But even so, they presented a lot of good information and argument in terms of what's going on with Paul. Some of it's pretty brutal and blatant. Like the fact that the Roman soldiers actually let Paul, as a prisoner, give a speech to his followers, and that the Romans who were co-persecutors with Paul before his conversion allowed him to be converted and switch over to the other side right in front of their face. Just allow it. Oh, now you're on the enemy side? Okay, cool. Now that you've been converted. So it's when you think of it as being just fiction, then it's just fiction. But when you pretend that this really happened, it's comical. Okay, so I just want to read the last paragraph of this preceding section, then we'll get into the next section. We can say for certain that the Gnostic themes in Paul's new religion were something totally different from what the Nazarenes were saying about Jesus. The question of whether Christianity, in the form given to it by Paul, is really continuous with Judaism, or whether it is a new doctrine having no roots in Judaism, is too large to be adequately discussed here. The question has been the subject of countless books and articles. Suffice it to say that it has been noticed that Pauline Christianity seems to draw from pagan myths of dying and resurrected gods, which is a common theme of these mystery cults. These pagan mystery cults, all of them had gods that died and were resurrected. Often on the same days, and sometimes having, many of the same stories. And Gnostic myths of heaven-descended redeemers. Did Paul truly stand in the Jewish tradition, or was he a Hellenistic religious type, seeking to give a coloring of Judaism to a salvation cult that was really opposed to everything that Judaism stood for? Some believe Paul combined Stoicism, Gnosticism, Judaism, and nascent Christian theology and transformed all of them into a mix of his own. We find it valid to ask whether this mixture also served a political purpose. See, right here, you would just hope that they could make the leap to be able to say, maybe the Romans had a more fundamental, a more fundamental role in this. I mean, does Paul have the academic background to be able to combine Stoicism, Gnosticism, Judaism, and nascent Christian theology and transform them all? Or maybe that was done by some of the highest intellectuals from the Roman court, all working as a team. A little Stoicism here, a little Gnosticism there, a little cynicism thrown in, some ancient Egyptian stuff, some zodiacal astrology stuff, and even some psychedelic blended stuff is all in there. Do you really think one person who was a persecutor would have been able to compile that, or would it have been done by a whole team of scholars? We believe one of Paul's driving forces may have been to erase anti-Roman attitudes that probably existed inside the Messianist movement. That echoes of this mission have survived in Acts. Now, this section is called Paul and the Rulers of the Age. That's in quotes, rulers of the age. One of the most controversial parts of Paul's teachings is his relationship to the Roman ruling power. In Romans 13, 1 through 7, he tells Christians, quote, "Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you. For he is God's servant to do you good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also because of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give everyone what you owe him. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. Could the Romans have asked for a more cooperative ideology? Hint, hint. The governing authorities, as they are presented in that section there in Romans, are benevolent and to be regarded with honor. Many people find this generous characterization of the governing authorities so disturbing that they call it a monumental contradiction in Paul's thought on several different levels, and argue that it addresses a subject that Paul discussed nowhere else. However, it is not a contradiction at all in the sense that in this passage he exchanges his usual implicit preaching of submission to the authorities, usually done by keeping silent about political issues, for an explicit one. He is simply sowing discord among more traditional messianists. A persistent contingent of scholars has even tried to reject Romans 13, 1 through 7, as a non-Pauline interpolation into the letter because it is so inconvenient to their theories. Seems like there's quite a few passages like that, though. Maybe not so blatant. And maybe, like they said, maybe it's implied more than explicit. Doesn't seem that way, though. I'll dig some more up. I think they should have dug some more up, too. They consider the passage too questionable to support the weight of any reconstruction of Paul's political views. Why? Because if they accept it as authentic, then Paul's view is that the Roman world order is God-ordained. There is no sense of estrangement between the world of God and the world of Rome. Nor is there any expectation of the end of this arrangement or this age. Some scholars have found such an idea so disturbing, they have argued that Paul was not even talking about Rome in this passage. Instead, they argue that he was referring to synagogue authorities. But what if this submission to Rome was exactly Paul's view? It may be the very key to his collaborationist stance and theology, which his whole life as an apostle points to. Why else would Paul have allowed such glowing characterizations of the Roman authorities to stand in his letter? The endorsement in Romans 13, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And those authorities that exist have been instituted by God, has been used for centuries as a justification for tyrants and a basis for acquiescence in the face of a ruler's gross injustice and abuse of his subjects. And like I would say, the New Testament is the world's greatest ever psychological operation. so great that it has not even been discovered after 1950 years. A scholar has written, Paul could not have ascribed such an exalted status to Rome without being not only hypocritical and servile, but untrue to his own theological position. Indeed. Many interpreters have tried to find the Roman situation that generated such a letter. Apologists suggest Paul's statements are merely rhetorical commonplace, meant only to focus the audience's attention on the discernment of the good and thereby keep Christians from making trouble in the streets. A true messianist would welcome this trouble, however, since it would help to overthrow the political status quo and thus facilitate the ascension on the throne of God's own king, the Messiah. One scholar, for example, attributes it to Christians' recruitment among slaves and the underprivileged. He characterizes them as having low morality, as factious, restless, and disaffected. And many of them were antagonistic to the Roman regime, only too willing to take part in subversive activities. Therefore, it was logical for Paul to impress upon them that they needed to behave peaceably and correctly, pay Roman taxes, and be submissive. They should honor and pray for the emperor and his representative. Some explain away the dilemma by suggesting that Paul accepted the system of honor operating on the public world of Greco-Roman society, but he rejected this society as shameful in the area of private life, gender roles, and sexuality. The fact remains that there is no evidence that Paul objected to the institution of the Roman state in and of itself, or desired to replace it with some other human political institution. Yeah, this is just an example of scholars humiliating themselves by being too emotionally attached to their beliefs to actually look at something rationally, and instead contort themselves and bend over backwards to make their case with the status quo. And unfortunately, these people are theologians, and so this is widespread among theologians going all the way back to the very beginning of the Christian movement, and what you call pious fraud. But this happens in science just as much as it happens in religion. So, this is what Thomas Kuhn is calling in his structure of the scientific revolutions. The whole history of scientific revolution is, of a paradigm shift of all kinds of scientists not being able to see what is right in front of their face, because if they see it, it kind of ruins their career, it ruins their credibility, and it will cause them to have to shift their paradigm. And so as a result, they do backflips to maintain the status quo, and as a result humiliated themselves in the long run, by backing outdated theories and even persecuting those who held the new theory, which turned out to be more correct. Okay, some believe the letter makes a great deal of sense when read against the general climate of anti-Jewish sentiment in Rome at the time. Rome had recently expelled Jews from the city because of riots at the instigation of Chrestus. Yeah, well, he's got a footnote there, but it's probably Josephus, and it might be Tacitus or Suetonius. None of them are credible because they're all Romans, and so they're all in on the psyop. And so there was no Chrestus, and there was no expelling of the Jews from the city by Nero, which is what he's referring to, I think. But maybe this Chrestus thing may have happened slightly earlier than, well, yeah, this is under Nero, right before, because they say Paul died in 62 AD. Nero became emperor in 54 AD. So that's what they're talking about. There's no evidence for that outside of Roman, psyopers. Mass discontent arose over exorbitant taxation during the reign of Nero, and more dubiously, Jews in Rome sympathetic to the revolutionary cause in Judea had supposedly expressed anti-Roman sentiments. Some have argued that Romans 13 is intended to help protect predominantly Gentile Christian Roman Church from the dangerous political fallout of Jewish nationalist agitation. According to one scholar, for example, Paul wanted Christians to subjugate themselves to the Roman government precisely because it restrains a troublesome nationalistic particularity, namely Israel's cause. Paul wanted no one else making the mistake of his countrymen, that is, identifying God's purpose of salvation with one particular nation's well-being and political dominance. These suggestions are closer to our argument that Paul wanted to separate Christians from the nationalistic Nazarenes and any hint of seditionist activity that had resulted in Jesus being killed. The question, even though he didn't bring it on, because he didn't do anything seditious to the Romans, the question remains whether Romans 13 was intended to head off the sort of public unrest that could have further jeopardized the already vulnerable situation of the beleaguered Jewish population of Rome. Who was Paul defending? Jews, Gentile Christians, Nazarenes? Some have argued that Paul wanted to defend the Roman Christians from the anti-Jewish attitudes that were already out there, so that they could not become scapegoats like the Jews in Rome under Claudius. Others say that he wanted to separate from the Jews entirely. This belief depends on whether one thinks Paul founded a new religion or not. For centuries, the standard view of Paul has been that he converted from one religion to another. The story became paradigmatic for later Christian conversions. Okay, we're going to stop there. Start up again tomorrow. And like, share, subscribe, and comment as you see fit. Thanks for tuning in today, and have a